For centuries, the world has been shown one version of Jesus, one image, one story, one memory. But what if that version was incomplete? What if the earliest Christians preserved truths that empire later edited out? What if Africa was not a footnote in Christianity, but one of its foundations? And what if Mary Magdalene was never meant to be remembered as a scandal, but as a trusted witness? Hidden within the Ethiopian biblical tradition is a version of Christian memory that challenges how Jesus is portrayed, how authority is defined, and why certain voices disappeared from history. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment. If you value uncovering forgotten history, challenging inherited narratives, and exploring faith beyond surface tradition, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who asks hard questions. Because what you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's memory long buried, finally resurfacing. Now, let's begin the story they never taught you. For centuries, the image of Jesus Christ has stared back at the world from stained glass windows, Renaissance paintings, movie screens, and church walls. Pale skin, long flowing hair, European features. That image has become so normalized that few people ever stop to ask a dangerous question. What if that image is wrong? Not symbolically wrong, not artistically inaccurate, but historically, culturally, and theologically incomplete. Because long before European Christianity shaped how the world would visualize Christ, another tradition was already preserving a very different story, one rooted in Africa, guarded by ancient texts, and carried by a church that predates most Western denominations. That tradition lives in Ethiopia, and within it lies a version of Jesus and a story of Mary Magdalene that challenges everything modern Christianity assumes it already knows. This is not a story about shock for shock's sake. This is about forgotten history, about suppressed voices, and about what happens when power decides which stories survive and which ones disappear. To understand what the Ethiopian tradition reveals, we must first confront a truth many believers have never been taught. Christianity did not begin in Europe. It did not grow first in Rome, and it did not originate from white faces and Western theology. Christianity took root early in Africa. Long before cathedrals rose in Paris or London, African believers were already reading scripture, preserving doctrine, and worshipping Christ in their own languages. Ethiopia, in particular, holds one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, dating back to the 1st century. According to the Book of Acts, an Ethiopian official encountered the gospel and carried it home. That moment was not symbolic, it was catalytic. Ethiopia would go on to develop a Christian identity that was not shaped by Rome, not filtered through European politics, and not later corrected by Western councils. This matters because the texts Ethiopia preserved are not identical to the ones the modern world inherited. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains the largest biblical canon in existence, a collection of scriptures that includes books most Christians have never read, never heard preached, and were never told existed. This collection is often called the Ethiopian Bible, and within its tradition and a portrayal of Christ that does not easily fit into the Western imagination. In Ethiopian iconography, Jesus is not depicted as a European king. He's shown with dark skin, African features, and a Semitic appearance that aligns far more closely with historical geography than Renaissance art ever did. This alone raises uncomfortable questions. If Jesus was born in the Middle East, if his family lived in Egypt as refugees, if his lineage traces back to Israel, not Europe, why does the global image of Christ look nothing like the region he came from? The Ethiopian tradition never needed to reimagine Jesus. They depicted him as familiar, as local, as near. And that is where the conversation about Black Jesus truly begins, not as a modern political statement, but as a historical correction. Yet the image of Christ is only the surface layer of this story. Beneath it lies something far more controversial, because alongside Ethiopia's understanding of Jesus is a preserved reverence for Mary Magdalene that sharply contrasts with how she is portrayed in most modern sermons. In Western Christianity, Mary Magdalene has often been reduced to a caricature. A repentant sinner, a woman with a dark past, a redeemed outcast whose primary role was to illustrate forgiveness, but that portrayal is not universal. In early Christian traditions, especially those outside Roman control, Mary Magdalene appears not as a disgraced woman, but as a central disciple, a witness, a bearer of revelation. She is the first person to see the resurrected Christ, the first commissioned to announce the resurrection, and in several early writings, she is shown as spiritually perceptive in ways others were not. So how did she become marginalized? The answer is not theological, it is political. As Christianity became institutionalized under Roman authority, leadership structures hardened, power centralized, and narratives that elevated women or challenged hierarchical control became inconvenient. Over time, certain texts were excluded, certain voices were silenced, and certain figures were reshaped to fit acceptable roles. Mary Magdalene was one of them. But Ethiopia stood apart from these developments because the Ethiopian church was not governed by Roman councils. It did not undergo the same editorial process. Its theology was not filtered through the same political anxieties, and its preservation of early Christian memory followed a different path. This is why the Ethiopian tradition remembers Mary Magdalene differently, not as a footnote, not as a warning story, but as a woman of authority, proximity, and spiritual insight. And when you place this alongside Ethiopia's portrayal of Jesus, not Europeanized, not sanitized, not detached from the African and Middle Eastern world, the implications are staggering. It suggests that what many believers consider orthodox may actually be a narrowed version of a much broader, older faith. A faith that once looked darker, sounded different, and empowered voices later pushed to the margins. This is not about replacing one cultural image with another. It is about asking why only one image was allowed to dominate for so long, why African Christianity was treated as peripheral instead of foundational, why Mary Magdalene's authority was softened into scandal, and why the global church inherited a Jesus shaped by empire rather than geography. The Ethiopian Bible does not shout these truths, it quietly preserves them. And in doing so, it forces us to confront an unsettling possibility, that what shocks us today is not the content of these revelations, but how unfamiliar they feel. Because history has a way of making truth seem radical when it has been hidden long enough. In the next section, we will go deeper into how Ethiopian Christianity developed independently, what makes its biblical canon unique, and why its preservation of early Christian memory matters more than most people realize. What you are about to hear next is not speculation. It is history untouched by empire, waiting to be remembered. To understand why the Ethiopian Bible preserves stories the rest of the Christian world lost, we must first understand how unusual Ethiopia's Christian journey truly was. Most people assume Christianity spread outward from Rome, refined by councils, guarded by bishops, and standardized by empire. That Ethiopia followed a different road, one that branched away from Roman control early and never fully returned. This divergence is not accidental. It is the reason Ethiopia remembers what others forgot. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 1st century, not as a state religion enforced by imperial decree, but as a faith carried through personal encounter and conviction. The Book of Acts records the baptism of an Ethiopian court official, an encounter that planted a seed long before Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. By the 4th century, Ethiopia formally adopted Christianity as a national faith, making it one of the earliest Christian nations in the world. But unlike Rome, Ethiopia was not attempting to unify a sprawling empire. It was not negotiating political stability through theology, and it was not reshaping doctrine to maintain centralized power. This difference mattered, because when Christianity later became entangled with imperial authority in Rome, theology stopped being purely spiritual. It became administrative, strategic, controlled. Councils were convened, creeds were drafted, texts were debated, and decisions were made often less about truth alone and more about unity, authority, and order. One of the most influential of these gatherings was the Council of Nicaea. Contrary to popular myth, the Council of Nicaea did not invent Christianity, but it did standardize it. It narrowed acceptable belief, it elevated certain interpretations, and it set boundaries around what would be considered orthodox. Texts that aligned with emerging hierarchy survived. Texts that complicated authority quietly disappeared. But Ethiopia was not under Roman jurisdiction. Its church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, developed largely outside the reach of these councils. While Rome was editing, Ethiopia was preserving. While Western Christianity was consolidating, Ethiopia was archiving. This is how the Ethiopian Bible came to be so different. Where most modern Christian Bibles contain 66 books, the Ethiopian canon contains over 80. These include texts such as 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and other writings that were widely read in early Christianity, but later excluded from Western scripture. These books were not fringe curiosities. They shaped how early believers understood angels, heaven, judgment, spiritual authority, and the nature of divine revelation. Yet, because they did not fit neatly into later doctrinal frameworks, they were gradually set aside in the West. Ethiopia never has set them aside. The Ethiopian Bible is not a revisionist project. It is not a modern conspiracy compilation. It is a living canon, passed down through liturgy, manuscript tradition, and communal memory. And this is crucial because when a tradition preserves more voices, it preserves more perspectives, especially women's voices. In Roman Christianity, leadership increasingly took on rigid masculine forms. Apostolic authority was interpreted narrowly. Spiritual hierarchy hardened into institutional hierarchy. Over time, stories that elevated women as teachers, visionaries, or authoritative witnesses became uncomfortable, so they faded. But in Ethiopia, where the church developed with different pressures, these stories were not subjected to the same filtering. This does not mean Ethiopia rejected structure or doctrine. It means its structure was not built on suppressing competing memories. And this is where Mary Magdalene re-enters the story. In early Christianity, Mary Magdalene was not an accessory to the male disciples. She was present at the crucifixion when most others fled. She was the first witness of the resurrection, and she was entrusted with the announcement that changed history, that alone should have secured her place. But authority in institutional religion is rarely about proximity, it is about control. In traditions shaped by empire, authority had to look predictable, male, hierarchical, non-threatening. A woman who received revelation before apostles disrupted that order. So the story was reframed. Over time, Mary Magdalene's identity shifted from apostolic witness to redeemed sinner. Her authority was softened into sentiment. Her voice was spiritualized but not empowered. This reframing did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, through sermons, art, commentary, and silence. But Ethiopia did not participate fully in that reframing. Because its church did not need to justify Roman leadership, it did not need to diminish female authority to protect institutional control, and it did not need to erase alternative apostolic memories to maintain unity. The result is subtle but profound. In Ethiopian tradition, holiness is not defined by conformity to empire. Authority is not proven by gender, and memory is not rewritten to suit power. This does not mean Ethiopia preserved a secret gospel hidden from the world. It means it never lost what others chose to let go. And when you combine this with Ethiopia's depiction of Jesus rooted in geography, Semitic identity, and African proximity, the picture becomes clearer. Western Christianity did not simply inherit a faith. It curated one, and curation always involves exclusion. The Ethiopian church stands as a reminder that Christianity did not have one single developmental path. There were parallel streams, some louder, some quieter, some dominant, some marginalized, but quiet streams still carry water. And now, in an age where people are questioning inherited narratives, those streams are being noticed again. This is why discussions about the Ethiopian Bible feel disruptive, not because they introduce foreign ideas, but because they reintroduce familiar ones that were deliberately minimized. A Jesus who does not resemble empire, a faith that took root in Africa early, and a woman disciple whose authority was never meant to be erased. In the next section, we will focus directly on Mary Magdalene herself, not the mythologized version, but the woman as early Christianity remembered her. Her role, her proximity to Jesus, and why her story became one of the most contested in Christian history. What you are about to hear next is where theology, gender, and power collide most clearly. And once you see it, you will never hear her name the same way again. Before Mary Magdalene became a controversy, she was simply present. Present at the margins where others stood at a distance. Present at the cross when fear scattered the disciples. Present at the tomb while grief still clung to the air. And most importantly, present when history turned. The earliest gospel accounts agree on one thing with striking consistency. Mary Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection. Not Peter, not John, not any of the 12, a woman. This detail alone should have reshaped Christian memory forever. In the ancient world, a woman's testimony was not considered legally reliable. If the gospel writers were fabricating a convincing story, Mary Magdalene would have been the worst possible choice. And yet, there she is at the center of the most important event in Christianity. That tells us something. It tells us that her role was too significant to erase at the beginning, too widely known to be denied outright, too embedded in the earliest tradition to be replaced. So instead of erasing her, history redefined her. To understand how that happened, we must first strip away one of the most enduring misconceptions in Christianity. Mary Magdalene was never identified as a prostitute in the Bible. That label does not appear in the Gospels. It is not stated explicitly or implicitly. It is a later invention. The confusion likely arose from a sermon in the 6th century, when Pope Gregory the Great conflated Mary Magdalene with other unnamed women described as sinners. That interpretation stuck not because it was accurate, but because it was useful. A repentant sinner is easier to manage than a female apostle. From that point on, Mary Magdalene was remembered not for what she knew, but for what she was supposedly forgiven of. Her proximity to Jesus was framed as emotional dependency rather than spiritual authority. Her presence at the resurrection was treated as sentiment rather than commission. But the Gospels themselves resist this reduction. Mary Magdalene is named more often than most of the male disciples. She is identified by her place of origin, Magdala, suggesting independence and status. She is described as having supported Jesus' ministry financially, implying resources, agency, and trust. And when the resurrected Christ appears, he does not tell her to go home quietly. He sends her with a message: "Go to my brothers and say to them." That is not consolation. That is commissioning. In effect, Mary Magdalene becomes the first apostle of the resurrection, the first messenger of the Gospel's core truth. This is why some early Christian writers referred to her as Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles, but titles like that create tension. Because if a woman can be an apostle by divine appointment, then authority no longer flows neatly through institutional channels. It flows through encounter, and encounter cannot be controlled. As Christianity spread and formalized, leaders began to wrestle with structure. Who leads? Who teaches? Who interprets doctrine? In a world already resistant to female authority, Mary Magdalene's prominence posed a problem. The solution was subtle but effective. Her story was not deleted, it was reframed. Her authority was not denied, it was spiritualized. Her leadership was not acknowledged, it was sentimentalized. She became the woman who loved Jesus deeply, rather than the woman who understood him clearly. Her insight was recast as emotion, her obedience as devotion, her role as secondary. And over time, that version replaced the original in popular imagination, but the cracks never fully sealed, because outside the Roman tradition, other memories persisted. In several early Christian writings texts that circulated widely before later exclusion, Mary Magdalene appears as a visionary, a teacher, and a recipient of revelation that even male disciples struggle to grasp. In these accounts, she speaks with clarity while others argue. She understands spiritual truths while others hesitate. And she defends her authority against challenges not with ambition, but with testimony. These writings unsettled later orthodoxy, because they contradicted Jesus, but because they complicated hierarchy. And this is where Ethiopian Christianity becomes critical. Unlike Roman Christianity, Ethiopia did not experience the same pressure to suppress alternative apostolic memories. Its tradition did not need to consolidate power through exclusion, and its theological imagination remained closer to the diversity of early Christianity. As a result, Mary Magdalene never fully disappeared in Ethiopian memory. She was not elevated above others, but she was not diminished either. She remained what the earliest witnesses remembered her to be, a trusted disciple, a bearer of truth, and a woman whose proximity to Jesus was spiritual, not scandalous. This reframes the question entirely. The issue is no longer whether Mary Magdalene was important. The Gospels already answer that. The issue is why her importance made later generations uncomfortable. Why did authority feel threatened by her witness? Why did devotion become a safer narrative than leadership? And why did her story need to be softened for mass consumption? When you ask those questions, you begin to see a pattern not just with Mary Magdalene, but with early Christianity as a whole. The faith began relational, it became institutional, and in the process, certain voices were adjusted to fit the structure. Mary Magdalene stands at the fault line of that transition. She represents a Christianity before empire, a movement driven by encounter rather than control, testimony rather than titles, and obedience rather than hierarchy. And Ethiopia, by standing slightly apart from Rome's editorial influence, preserved echoes of that earlier faith. This does not mean Ethiopian Christianity is perfect or immune to history, but it does mean it remembers something others learn to forget. In the next section, we will turn directly to the Ethiopian biblical tradition itself, what text it preserves, how it frames authority, and what its treatment of Mary Magdalene reveals about early Christian memory before it was filtered through empire. What comes next is where preservation becomes revelation. And once you see how much survived outside the West, the question will no longer be why this shocks you, but why you were never told. To understand what the Ethiopian tradition reveals about Mary Magdalene, we must shift our focus from individuals to memory itself, because history is not only shaped by what happens, but by what is remembered, and remembrance is never neutral. Every religious tradition must decide which voices are amplified, which are harmonized, and which are quietly allowed to fade. In the Western Church, those decisions were shaped by councils, creeds, and the needs of empire. In Ethiopia, memory followed a different logic, one rooted less in administration and more in continuity. The Ethiopian Bible is not merely a longer list of books. It represents a different philosophy of preservation, where Western Christianity eventually narrowed its canon to protect doctrinal uniformity. Ethiopia preserved a broader textual ecosystem. It allowed multiple streams of early Jewish and Christian thought to coexist. Instead of flattening theological diversity, it carried it forward. This matters because early Christianity was not monolithic. The first generations of believers lived before fixed creeds, before centralized authority, and before orthodoxy was enforced through institutional power. Their faith was shaped through storytelling, liturgy, letters, and lived witness. Theology was relational before it became systematic. The Ethiopian tradition reflects this earlier stage. Its canon includes writings that explore angels, visions, cosmic order, and divine justice in ways that later Western theology found uncomfortable. These texts were not heretical in their time, they were formative. They shaped how early believers understood revelation, authority, and proximity to God, and crucially, they did not limit spiritual authority to office alone. In Ethiopian Christianity, authority flows through faithfulness, proximity, obedience, and divine calling, not solely through hierarchical rank. This framework leaves space for figures like Mary Magdalene without forcing them into contradiction. She does not need to be either scandal or symbol. She can simply be what the Gospels already present her as, a faithful disciple entrusted with revelation. This is why Mary Magdalene's presence does not feel threatening within Ethiopian memory. There was no urgent need to reinterpret her role, because the system itself was not built on excluding her. The Ethiopian tradition did not require all authority to flow through male institutional succession in the same rigid way. Its theology was not structured to fear alternative witnesses. This does not mean Ethiopian Christianity was egalitarian in every modern sense. It does mean that the early Christian memory preserved was not aggressively edited to fit imperial anxieties. When Western Christianity began to standardize belief, it did so under immense pressure. Unity was survival, dissent was danger, diversity was instability. Texts that complicated leadership structures were not always rejected outright, but they were sidelined. Stories that empowered women were not erased, but they were reframed. Memory was shaped to protect order. Ethiopia, geographically and politically distant from Rome's center of power, did not face the same existential threats. It did not need to weaponize theology for cohesion. Its Christianity grew organically within its culture, absorbing Hebrew roots, African contexts, and early Christian theology together. As a result, its biblical memory feels less defensive. This is where the Ethiopian understanding of holiness becomes important. In Western theology, holiness increasingly became associated with moral correction and institutional conformity. Authority was proven through rank, orthodoxy through alignment. In Ethiopian theology, holiness is closely tied to endurance, obedience, and continuity. Saints are remembered for perseverance, not platform. Faith is measured by alignment with God, not visibility within hierarchy. This creates a different spiritual climate. In that climate, Mary Magdalene does not need to be reduced to a lesson about forgiveness. She can remain a witness, a bearer of truth, a woman trusted with divine instruction. And that trust is the key issue. Because when Jesus entrusted Mary Magdalene with the announcement of the resurrection, he did more than comfort her grief. He validated her reliability. In a culture where testimony was power, he gave her power. The Ethiopian tradition, fully lost sight of that, while Western art and preaching gradually emphasized Mary's emotion, her tears, her devotion, her longing. The Ethiopian memory emphasizes her presence and obedience. She is remembered less for how she felt, and more for what she did. She went, she spoke, she delivered the message. And the message reshaped history. This difference may seem subtle, but it is decisive. Emotion can be admired without consequence. Authority changes structure. By preserving a broader canon and a less politicized memory, Ethiopian Christianity retained a version of early faith where women's proximity to revelation was not inherently destabilizing. And that brings us back to the image of Jesus himself. In Ethiopian art and theology, Jesus is not distant from the African world. He's familiar, grounded, near. His humanity is emphasized alongside his divinity. His body is not abstracted into European ideals. This matters because bodies carry meaning. When Jesus is portrayed as culturally distant, authority feels imported. When he is portrayed as local, authority feels relational. The Ethiopian Jesus does not arrive as empire, he arrives as presence. And a Jesus who arrives as presence does not fear witnesses, male or female, who testify truthfully. This is why the Ethiopian Bible feels disruptive to modern readers. Not because it invents new theology, but because it preserves an old one. A theology before empire, before control, before memory was curated for safety. In the next section, we will move even closer to the heart of the controversy, the specific traditions and interpretations surrounding Mary Magdalene that survived outside the Western canon, and how they challenged the narratives most believers inherited without question. What comes next will not ask you to abandon your faith. It will ask you to expand your memory. And sometimes, expansion feels like shock only, because contraction felt normal for so long. When stories are inconvenient, they rarely disappear all at once. They linger. They survive in fragments, in oral memory, inside texts, in regional traditions that power cannot easily reach. And this is exactly what happened with the memory of Mary Magdalene. While Western Christianity gradually settled into a version of her story that emphasized repentance over authority, other Christian traditions continued to remember her differently, not loudly, not polemically, but faithfully. Ethiopia was one of those places. In the Ethiopian Christian imagination, Mary Magdalene does not exist in tension with the apostles. She exists alongside them. Her presence is not a theological problem to be solved, but a historical reality to be honored. This distinction is critical, because once you accept that early Christianity was diverse, you begin to see that Mary Magdalene's prominence was not an anomaly, it was part of a broader pattern. Early Christian communities did not all organize themselves the same way. Some were structured around households, others around itinerant teachers. Authority often flowed through spiritual maturity and proximity to Jesus' teaching rather than formal office. In such a landscape, Mary Magdalene's role makes perfect sense. She was not claiming power. She was entrusted with testimony. And testimony is the lifeblood of a movement built on resurrection. The Ethiopian tradition, by preserving early memory without heavy institutional editing, retained this logic. Mary Magdalene was remembered as someone who knew, not merely someone who felt. This is where later Western discomfort becomes more visible. A woman who knows challenges systems built on gatekeeping knowledge. As Christianity became more centralized, theological authority increasingly moved upward into councils, bishops, and eventually creeds. Knowledge was regulated, interpretation became restricted, and access to teaching roles narrowed. Mary Magdalene's memory, left untouched, resisted that narrowing. So instead, her story was softened, her devotion was highlighted, her emotional loyalty was praised, her insight was quietly downplayed. But even in the West, traces of the older memory have vanished completely. Why else would Mary Magdalene appear so persistently in Christian art, literature, and devotion? Why would she remain one of the most recognizable figures in the gospel narrative if her role were truly marginal? Because something about her could not be erased without unraveling the resurrection story itself. She was there too early. She knew too much. She spoke too soon. And Ethiopia never forgot that. In Ethiopian liturgical memory, Mary Magdalene is honored primarily for her witness. Her identity is not collapsed into sinfulness. Her value is not derived from contrast with male disciples. She stands on her own as a participant in sacred history. This does not mean Ethiopian Christianity represents her as a rival to the apostles. It means it does not need to diminish her to elevate them. That balance reveals something important about power. Systems insecure about authority just constantly protect it. Systems confident in truth do not. The Ethiopian church, shaped outside Roman anxiety, had less reason to fear shared memory. And this brings us to the idea of shock. Why do modern audiences find these perspectives shocking? Not because they are extreme, but because they are unfamiliar. Most believers were raised on a version of Christianity that presented itself as singular, settled, and uniform. Variations were labeled heresy, diversity was framed as deviation, and African Christianity, in particular, was often treated as peripheral rather than foundational. So when people encounter the Ethiopian Bible and its preserved traditions, it feels destabilizing. But destabilization is not deception, it is often correction. The Ethiopian tradition does not claim Mary Magdalene held secret doctrines withheld from others. It does not suggest she replaced male leadership. What it preserves is simpler and more disruptive. She was trusted. She was reliable. She was chosen. And that reality complicates any theology that insists women's authority must always be secondary, indirect, or symbolic. It also complicates how we understand Jesus himself, because Jesus is revealed not only through what he taught but through whom he trusted. He trusted fishermen, he trusted tax collectors, he trusted the marginalized, and he trusted Mary Magdalene with the announcement that would define Christianity forever. Any tradition that downplays that trust is not being cautious, it is being selective. The Ethiopian Church's refusal to fully participate in that selectivity is what makes its memory powerful. It shows us that Christianity once existed without needing to explain away female authority, without fearing proximity, without rewriting stories to protect hierarchy. This does not mean modern Christianity is illegitimate. It means it is incomplete, and incompleteness often masquerades as certainty. Mary Magdalene stands as a reminder that faith began before it was systematized, before it was governed, before it was curated for mass consumption. She represents the Christianity of encounter, raw, relational, and unguarded. And Ethiopia, by preserving early memory, preserves that encounter more clearly than many realize. In the next section, we will confront the most provocative part of this conversation: how race, geography, and representation shaped the image of Jesus himself, and how Mary Magdalene's story cannot be separated from that larger reframing. Because once Jesus was made distant from his historical world, everyone close to him had to be reinterpreted too. What comes next will connect the dots between Black Jesus, African Christianity, and why Mary Magdalene's authority faded at the same time Christ's image was transformed. And by the end of it, the question will no longer be whether history was edited, but who benefited from the edit. Images are never neutral. They teach before words do. They shape instinct before doctrine has a chance to speak. And once an image becomes dominant, it quietly decides who belongs and who feels foreign. This is why the question of Black Jesus cannot be separated from the question of Mary Magdalene, because when Jesus was reimagined, everyone closest to him had to be reimagined too. Historically, Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Jew from the Middle East born into a colonized land, living under Roman occupation and moving through regions that connect Africa and Asia. His world was brown, Semitic, textured by desert, empire, and displacement. This is not controversial history, yet the dominant global image of Jesus Christ tells a different story. Over centuries, as Christianity became the religion of empire, Jesus slowly began to look like the empire that claimed him. His skin lightened, his features softened. His body was reshaped to mirror European ideals of nobility, restraint, and authority. This was not a single decision, it was a long cultural drift. Art followed power. Power shaped theology. Theology reinforced art. By the time Christianity spread globally through colonial expansion, the European Jesus was no longer seen as an interpretation. He was treated as default. And that default mattered, because once Jesus was imagined as culturally distant from Africa and the Middle East, African Christianity itself began to seem secondary and offshoot, rather than an origin. Ethiopia, despite its ancient faith, was reframed as peripheral. Its texts were treated as curiosities instead of witnesses. This distancing had consequences. If Jesus was European in imagination, then authority looked European too. Theology flowed outward from the West. African interpretations were viewed as adaptations rather than inheritances, and within that framework, Mary Magdalene's authority became even more difficult to sustain. A woman close to a Middle Eastern, non-European Jesus already disrupted patriarchal norms. But a woman close to a Jesus reimagined as European nobility disrupted something deeper, the alignment of holiness with power. So the silencing intensified. Mary Magdalene was not only inconvenient because she was a woman. She was inconvenient because she represented intimacy with a Jesus who did not resemble empire. Her proximity suggested that authority came from encounter, not institution. From obedience, not office. From trust, not rank. And that kind of authority is dangerous to centralized power. So the same forces that repainted Jesus also reinterpreted Mary Magdalene. As Christ became distant, formal, and imperial, his witnesses had to become symbolic rather than authoritative, emotional rather than instructional, admirers rather than messengers. Mary Magdalene was transformed into a figure of personal devotion, not public proclamation. And once that shift occurred, it became easier to universalize. A European Jesus could be presented as universal, while quietly excluding non-European bodies from theological centrality. A softened Mary Magdalene could be celebrated without challenging gender hierarchy. This is how power maintains itself by aesthetic alignment. Ethiopia resisted that alignment, because Ethiopian needed to repaint Jesus to justify its authority. Jesus already belonged. He was not foreign. He was not imported. He was not filtered through colonial imagination. In Ethiopian iconography, Jesus looks familiar, not idealized. His body carries weight. His face reflects the region. His humanity is emphasized, not abstracted. This matters because representation shapes theology. When Jesus looks like empire, empire feels sanctified. When Jesus looks like the oppressed, power feels questioned. And Ethiopia preserved a Jesus whose image never fully sanctified empire. This is why the Ethiopian tradition's memory of Mary Magdalene survives more intact. Because when Jesus remains rooted in his historical world, his relationships remain grounded too. His trust in women does not need explanation. His elevation of the marginalized does not feel symbolic. His choice of witnesses makes sense. But when Jesus is lifted out of that world and placed into the aesthetics of dominance, everything changes. Suddenly, proximity must be controlled. Authority must be managed. Witness must be regulated. Mary Magdalene becomes less a messenger and more a metaphor. The resurrection becomes a doctrine rather than an event with witnesses. And Christianity becomes safer but thinner. This is why conversations about Black Jesus often trigger discomfort. Not because they deny Christ's divinity, but because they restore his humanity in a way that disrupts inherited power structures. A Jesus who looks African or Middle Eastern cannot be easily claimed by one culture as its own. He resists ownership. He resists domestication. And a Jesus who resists ownership naturally empowers witnesses outside dominant systems, including women, including Africans, including those history trained us to see as secondary. Mary Magdalene belongs in that group not as an exception, but as an early example. She was not trusted because she fit hierarchy. She was trusted because she was faithful, and faithfulness is not gendered. As Christianity aligned itself with empire, it learned to prioritize control over memory. The image of Jesus became uniform. The voices around him became curated. But Ethiopia, standing outside that alignment, preserves something older. Not a secret, not a conspiracy, a continuity. In the next section, we will confront the modern implications of this history, how reclaiming African Christian memory and restoring figures like Mary Magdalene shapes faith today. Because the real question is no longer what was lost, but what happens when it is remembered. History does not stay buried forever. It waits. It waits for the moment when people become honest enough to ask difficult questions and humble enough to admit that what they inherited may not be complete. That moment is now. The renewed conversation around African Christianity, Black Jesus, and Mary Magdalene is not happening because of rebellion, it is happening because of hunger. A hunger for a faith that feels rooted rather than abstract, honest rather than curated, alive rather than inherited by default. For many believers, Christianity has begun to feel distant from its own origins. Scripture feels familiar, yet oddly disconnected from history. Jesus is adored, but often detached from the world he actually lived in. And voices like Mary Magdalene's feel strangely muted for a movement built on testimony. This dissonance is not accidental. It is the result of generations of selective memory. Western Christianity did not deliberately set out to erase African roots or silence women, but once faith aligned with power, memory became strategic. Stories that supported order were amplified. Stories that complicated authority were softened or sidelined. Over time, those choices hardened into tradition. And tradition, once established, feels timeless even when it is not. This is why remembering Ethiopia matters so deeply. Ethiopia stands as a living contradiction to the idea that Christianity has one center and one voice. It reminds the modern world that the faith grew in multiple places at once. Africa included, and that not all of those places surrendered their memory to empire. The Ethiopian Christian tradition is just a faith that developed without needing to dominate, without needing to repaint Jesus to look powerful, without needing to reinterpret Mary Magdalene to feel safe. And when that memory resurfaces today, it challenges modern believers in uncomfortable but necessary ways. It challenges racial assumptions embedded in theology. If Jesus was not European in body or culture, then Western Christianity is not the default, it is one expression among many. That realization does not weaken faith, it humbles it. It challenges gender assumptions embedded in leadership. If Mary Magdalene was trusted with the resurrection message, then spiritual authority cannot be reduced to gender without contradicting the gospel's foundation. And it challenges how we define orthodoxy itself. Because orthodoxy shaped by empire is not the same as orthodoxy shaped by encounter. Remembering this does not require rejecting Western Christianity. It requires decentering it. Decentering does not mean erasing. It means allowing room for other witnesses to speak without being treated as threats. This is where many modern debates stall. People fear that acknowledging Black Jesus or Mary Magdalene's authority will dismantle faith. But what it actually dismantles is false universality, the assumption that one cultural expression equals truth itself. Truth does not fear context. If Jesus is truly divine, his humanity can withstand historical honesty. If the resurrection is real, its first witness does not need to be reimagined as less authoritative. And if Christianity is universal, it must be able to hold African memory without discomfort. Ethiopia proves that this is possible. For centuries, Ethiopian Christians worshipped Christ without needing Western validation. They prayed, fasted, preserved scripture, and passed down memory quietly while the rest of the world assumed Christianity had one face. Now, that assumption is being questioned, and Mary Magdalene is returning to the conversation as a symbol of controversy, but as a measure of integrity. Because how a tradition treats its earliest witnesses reveals what it values. A faith that diminishes its first messenger of resurrection is still preached truth, but it preaches it selectively. A faith that repaints its Messiah to resemble power may still proclaim love, but it does so through the language of dominance. Remembering Ethiopian Christianity exposes those contradictions. It reminds believers that Jesus trusted people outside structures, that he chose witnesses without consulting hierarchy, that he announced the kingdom through those empire did not expect. And it invites modern believers to ask a dangerous but liberating question. What else have we accepted as normal simply because it was inherited? The goal of this remembering is not to replace one image with another. It is to restore proportion. Jesus does not need to be exclusively black or white to be true. But he cannot be historically dishonest without consequence. Mary Magdalene does not need to be exalted beyond Scripture, but she cannot be diminished without distortion. The Ethiopian Bible and its tradition remind us that Christianity once held these truths without anxiety, that faith once existed without needing to guard power so fiercely, and that the gospel did not begin with control but with witness. As modern believers rediscover these roots, faith becomes less about defending tradition and more about discerning truth, less about preserving comfort and more about honoring memory. This is why this conversation feels disruptive, not because it destroys belief, but because it demands maturity. It asks believers to move beyond the faith they inherited and toward the faith that was lived. And that journey is never easy, but it is always necessary. In the final section, we will bring everything together: Black Jesus, the Ethiopian Bible, Mary Magdalene, and the cost of selective memory, and ask the most important question of all: what kind of faith are we willing to remember? Every faith carries two histories. One is the history. It tells openly the polished narrative passed down through sermons, creeds, and tradition. The other is the history. It inherits quietly the fragments, silences, and suppressed memories that linger beneath the surface. Christianity is no different. What we have traced through this journey from Ethiopia to Mary Magdalene, from Black Jesus to edited memory, is not a secret religion or an alternative gospel. It is something far more unsettling. It is the reminder that Christianity was once larger than the version most people were taught. Before empire shaped it, before art standardized it, before authority narrowed it, the Ethiopian tradition stands as living proof that early Christianity was not a single stream flowing from Rome outward, but a network of rivers, some louder, some quieter, all feeding the same faith. And when those rivers were later redirected, something was lost, not truth but balance. The cost of forgetting is not disbelief, it is distortion. When Jesus is removed from his historical world, faith becomes abstract. When African Christianity is treated as peripheral, memory becomes colonial. And when Mary Magdalene is reduced to a moral lesson instead of honored as a witness, authority becomes selective. This is why the image of Jesus matters, not because salvation depends on skin color, but because representation reveals allegiance. A Jesus reshaped to resemble power subtly teaches that power is holy. A Jesus detached from the oppressed world he inhabited quietly sanctifies dominance. But the Jesus remembered in Ethiopia, grounded, Semitic, familiar, resists that alignment. He does not arrive as empire, he arrives as presence. And presence changes everything, because a Jesus who arrives as presence does not fear witnesses. He does not restrict testimony to acceptable voices. He does not choose messengers based on hierarchy. He chooses the faithful. That is why Mary Magdalene matters so deeply to this story. She is not important because she was controversial. She is important because she was trusted. Trusted enough to stay when others fled. Trusted enough to see what others missed. Trusted enough to speak when silence would have been safer. The resurrection did not begin as doctrine. It began as testimony. And that testimony came from a woman whose authority later generations struggled to accommodate. Instead of asking why Jesus chose her, tradition asked how to reinterpret her. Instead of expanding authority, it narrowed it. And once that narrowing began, it did not stop with Mary Magdalene. It extended to African Christianity, to non-Western theology, to voices that did not resemble the emerging center of power. Over time, Christianity became familiar, but less whole. This is why the Ethiopian Bible feels shocking to modern readers. Not because it introduces something alien, but because it preserves something ancient. It reminds us that Scripture once circulated in broader forms, that theology once tolerated mystery, that faith once lived comfortably with diversity. And it forces us to confront a difficult truth. What many believers call orthodoxy is often the result of historical survival, not exclusive accuracy. Survival required unity. Unity required editing. Editing required forgetting. Ethiopia forgot less. And because it forgot less, It preserved more voices, more memory, more context. This does not make Ethiopian Christianity superior. It makes it instructive. It shows us what Christianity looked like before it needed to justify power. And that perspective is invaluable today. Because modern Christianity is facing a crisis not of belief, but of credibility. People are not leaving faith because they hate Jesus. They are leaving because the version of Christianity they inherited feels disconnected from truth, history, and integrity. They sense the gaps, they feel the contradictions. And when they discover that African Christianity was ancient, that Jesus did not resemble empire, and that a woman announced the resurrection, first, it does not destroy faith. It often restores it, because a faith that can withstand honesty is stronger than one protected by silence. Remembering Black Jesus does not diminish Christ's divinity. It restores his humanity. Remembering Mary Magdalene does not threaten biblical authority. It honors it. And remembering Ethiopian Christianity does not fragment the church. It reminds it that unity does not require uniformity. The real danger was never these truths. The danger was pretending they did not exist. The cost of forgetting is a faith that feels hollow. The power of remembering is a faith that feels alive. This is not a call to abandon tradition. It is a call to deepen it, to recognize that Christianity did not begin as a European religion, that authority was not always centralized, and that God-trusted voices history later tried to quiet. If the resurrection could be entrusted to Mary Magdalene, if the gospel could take root early in Africa, if faith could flourish outside empire, then perhaps Christianity was never meant to look as narrow as we made it. Perhaps it was always meant to be wider, darker, more disruptive. And perhaps the shock we feel today is not because these truths are radical, but because we are finally ready to remember what was never meant to be forgotten. What you've just encountered is not a replacement for faith, it is a recovery of memory, a reminder that Christianity did not begin in empire, did not grow only in Europe, and was never meant to silence the voices closest to its greatest moment. From Ethiopia's preserved tradition to the forgotten authority of Mary Magdalene, this story reveals a faith that once breathed freely before it was edited for comfort and control. A Jesus rooted in his world, witnesses trusted without hierarchy, truth carried, not curated. The real question is no longer what was hidden, but what we are willing to remember. If this video challenged you, like it. If it expanded your understanding, subscribe. If it stirred questions, share it with someone who thinks deeply. And most importantly, drop a comment below. What part of this story stayed with you? Because conversations like this don't end here. They begin here.